Anatomy, take 1. We are looking at the dorsal side of the sheep brain, and we are about to walk through some of the major regions, structures, and orientation areas. So we already said this is the dorsal view, or the dorsal side of the sheep brain. We can take a look at then the major structures we see here on the dorsal side, but first let's review some of the positions, the terminology associated with position. So up here in the top area here of the brain, we're going to call this the anterior area, or because it's toward the nose, we can also call it rostral. So we have an anterior or rostral area, and then as we proceed and go back toward the back half of the brain, we are going posterior, so here's toward the posterior region, or caudal, toward the tail. We can also talk about the brain in terms of position when we look at structures relative to one another. So from the whole brain perspective, we see that this medial area right here, meaning right down the middle, medial area is here. And then we can say on this either side of the medial area, we can call that lateral. So we have medial, lateral, we have anterior or rostral, and we have posterior or caudal. Now, to the major regions that we're looking at here, we have this whole area on both sides where we see all these areas that are raised, the gyri, and we see areas which are indented or sort of depressed, and those are the sulci. We see some of these are more obvious than others. This one right here on a sheep brain is a little harder to see than in the human brain. So this right here on here, both sides, we would say is the more or less analogous to our central sulcus. So that's an example of one of the sulci, or an individual sulcus, so that's plural, is sulci. Singular is sulcus. And that is a dividing line between the frontal lobe, right here, frontal, and this large area behind it, known as the parietal. If we go lateral to this, then we are reaching into the area we call the temporal lobe. And if we go posterior, continuing posterior or caudally, we are going toward the area of the brain we know of as the occipital lobe. We also have this large region back here of the brain we know as the cerebellum, which also has a right and a left hemisphere, and a large kind of segmented structure that goes down the middle called the vermis, which has these segments actually make it look like a worm, and the word vermis is referring to worm-like. As we continue further caudally, we see extending outward from this side the spinal cord. Both of these are called cerebral hemispheres. Collectively, we could call this the cerebrum, and that's the basal side of the brain. We know that the brain has a coating on the outside of it, 3 layers, one that's very delicate, that kind of contacts directly the surface of the brain, which is the pia mater. There is a web-like structure that has blood vessels running through it right above that. And so there are probably a few blood vessels in here, which are the arachnoid layer. And then finally, something that we cannot see here, but is a hard coating, kind of a real tough outer coating, the dura mater. And together, the pia mater from the inside, the arachnoid layer, and the dura mater on the outside form the area or the structure we know of as the meninges. So the meninges coats and surrounds all of the brain and the spinal cord, so it protects it and it nourishes it. We're now going to flip to the basal view. Hopefully this doesn't go out of focus too much. So here we are on the basal side, the basal view of the brain. We can look here, so this is lateral, this is medial, right down the midline. Here's anterior or rostral. Here's posterior or caudal. A prominent feature on the basal side of the sheep brain are two white matter tracts. Remember that white matter has to do with a part of the neuron which has a kind of a fatty coating on it. We're about to learn about that. But this is white matter, and this is called the olfactory bulb on both sides, which you know is responsible for the sense of smell. Continuing more medially and posteriorly, okay, so we're going back this direction, but we're kind of going more toward the middle. We see a cross here of white matter again. That white matter is a part of this, the optic tract and optic chiasm, which actually means cross. If we find this landmark, this little opening right here, and we continue back behind it, what we find is this area that we're going to see a little bit better internally, which is the hypothalamus. And if this would have been a perfect brain and we didn't have anything removed, we would also see a little stalk-like structure with a little almost P-shaped piece of it that would be extending off here, which would be the pituitary gland. But right now we really can't see that. It's been removed when all the meninges were taken away. This part in here, okay, we're kind of looking at, this as being the forebrain. Here we are in sort of the midbrain region. And then behind that, we call this the hindbrain, which in our view of this, we can see this kind of pouched out area a little bit extended, which is the pons. On down, we see something that's a little longer and a little thinner. That's the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. And then finally down into the spinal cord. We can also see parts here of the temporal lobes on both sides from the basal view of this brain. Remember that we really are looking at two colors. We have white matter and we have gray matter. So remember that for our next topic when we look at specifically at the neurons. But we also look at these large areas of white matter. We very often call them a tract. So a white matter tract. Now I'm going to stop here so that I can then set up for the sagittal cut and look at the interior structures from that view.